Ethan had always prided himself on being a man of logic. As a scientist, his life revolved around cold, hard facts, numbers, equations, and theories. The cosmos had always fascinated him, but it was the study of stars, planets, and galaxies that kept him grounded in the predictable. Nothing in his life prepared him for the unexplainable event that would shatter his worldview. It started on an ordinary night. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light over the quiet countryside where Ethan lived. The stars twinkled like diamonds scattered across velvet, and the world seemed suspended in peaceful silence. Ethan sat alone in his lab, reviewing data from his recent projects. His mind wandered as it often did, contemplating the vastness of the universe. Then the ground trembled. At first, Ethan thought it was just a passing earthquake, a rare occurrence in this part of the world. But then, the rumbling grew stronger, more forceful, shaking the walls of his small cabin. The earth beneath his feet seemed to heave, sending a surge of panic through his chest. He rushed to the window and stared out into the night, only to be met with a sight that could not possibly exist. A brilliant streak of light blazed across the sky. It was no meteor. This was something far more controlled, too sharp, too precise in its descent. The object was enormous, a gleaming mass of metal and energy, descending straight toward the forest behind his home. In that moment, Ethan's mind raced. He grabbed his jacket, threw open the door, and sprinted toward the woods. His heart pounded in his chest, the thrill of the unknown overtaking his rational mind. A crash, loud enough to shake the very atmosphere, followed by a cloud of smoke and debris, erupted into the night. The force of the impact sent Ethan stumbling forward, but he pushed onward, adrenaline driving him through the thick underbrush of the forest. His boots hit the dirt, twigs and branches snapping underfoot, as he followed the bright glow in the distance. The crash site was only a few hundred yards away, but it felt like a lifetime before he finally reached it. The sight before him was nothing short of extraordinary. A ship, no, a craft, had landed, but not in the way one would expect. It wasn't like any aircraft from Earth. It was sleek, metallic, with a glowing energy field surrounding it, flickering and pulsing as though alive. The ship was clearly damaged, the exterior scorched and cracked, but still intact. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he surveyed the wreckage. The silence that followed was suffocating. No explosions. No chaos. Just stillness, broken only by the distant crackle of fire and the smell of burning metal. As he approached cautiously, he saw movement near the wreckage. Something, or rather, someone, was lying in the debris. A girl. Her form was pale, glowing faintly in the dark, a soft, ethereal blue tint to her skin. Her hair, long and silvery, floated slightly above her head, almost as if it were weightless. Her features were delicate, too delicate to be human, but still somehow familiar. Her eyes, large and luminous, were closed, her body limp, as though she had been knocked unconscious by the crash. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Every instinct screamed at him to stay away, to call for help, to run. But something deep within him, the scientist, the curious observer, compelled him to approach. He knelt beside her, examining her closely. She was beautiful, but in a way that was almost otherworldly, too perfect, too alien to be real. Her face was calm, as though she were in a deep sleep, though her breathing was shallow. There was a faint hum, almost imperceptible, coming from her body, a low, melodic sound that seemed to resonate with the very air around them. Ethan quickly checked for any signs of injury, but there were no obvious wounds. He gently placed his hand on her forehead, feeling warmth beneath his fingers. The fact that she was alive filled him with a strange sense of relief, but the unknown nature of her existence left him uneasy. Who was she? Where did she come from? Suddenly, the girl stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, revealing iridescent colors swirling in them, like the sky during a lightning storm. She looked at Ethan, her gaze filled with confusion, fear, and curiosity. Her lips parted, but no words came out, only a strange, melodic sound, like a song that Ethan couldn't quite understand. Ethan recoiled slightly, unsure of how to respond. The creature before him was no ordinary human. She was something else entirely. But the intensity of her gaze drew him in, and instinctively, he spoke to her, trying to convey calmness in his voice. "It's okay," he murmured softly. "You're safe now. I'm here to help." The girl's body tensed for a moment, and then she raised her hand toward him, her movements slow and deliberate. The gesture was one of caution, and Ethan was careful not to make any sudden moves. The air between them seemed charged, as though she were trying to communicate, to understand him. Her lips parted again, and this time, she spoke. The words were foreign, not a language that Ethan recognized, but there was a certain beauty to them, an elegance in the way they flowed from her mouth. He didn't understand, but the tone of her voice sounded like a question, a plea for help. Ethan blinked, struggling to make sense of the situation. He could hear the sound of sirens in the distance now, the faintest hint of human activity approaching. Time was running out. He needed to act quickly. "Listen," he said, "I don't know who or what you are, but I won't let them hurt you." He gently placed his hand on hers, feeling a slight pulse of warmth, a connection, fragile but real. She blinked at him, her expression uncertain. She tried to speak again, but this time Ethan shook his head. "No words," he whispered. "No time." Without another thought, he carefully lifted her in his arms, cradling her against him. The forest was no longer quiet. The distant sounds of human pursuit were growing louder. As Ethan carried her away from the crash site, the girl's eyes remained fixed on him, her alien gaze searching his face as if trying to read him, understand him. Though they were worlds apart, in that brief moment, there was a quiet connection, a shared understanding between two beings from different worlds, brought together by the forces of fate. In the days following the crash, Ethan did everything he could to help the girl he had named Lyra. Her recovery was astonishing, almost too fast to be real. Her alien physiology seemed to heal faster than any human's, and while she was still visibly fragile, the light in her eyes was brighter each day. The glow that enveloped her skin faded to a more subdued shimmer, a faint reminder of the world she came from. Ethan had always been rational, and the sight of her alien beauty left him both awestruck and perplexed. He had learned a lot about alien species through his scientific studies, but Lyra wasn't like any of the theoretical beings he had read about. She wasn't a creature of myth or fantasy, she was real, and she was here. And though he couldn't fully understand her origins or her technology, there was something about her that felt so familiar, almost human. Despite the surreal circumstances, they found a rhythm. Every day, Lyra learned more about Earth and its ways. She watched as Ethan went about his daily tasks, working on his computer, preparing food, reading, but it was clear that her mind was constantly active. She was intelligent, sharper than most humans Ethan had met, and her thirst for knowledge was insatiable. They communicated in broken sentences at first. Ethan had no way of learning her language completely, but over time, they began to bridge the gap. Lyra learned English, albeit haltingly, while Ethan picked up bits of her language, fascinated by its melodic quality and the way certain sounds seemed to reverberate through the air. But even as their connection deepened, a shadow loomed over them. Something far more dangerous than the isolation of their situation was creeping closer, and Ethan could feel it. The quiet days of learning and bonding were being overshadowed by an impending storm. The first real sign that something was wrong came in the form of a strange vibration in the air, subtle at first, like the buzzing of an insect in the distance. But soon, the frequency of the hum increased. The ground seemed to tremble slightly, just enough for Ethan to notice, but it was enough to make his heart skip a beat. He wasn't alone in this. Ethan tried to brush it off, blaming it on the stress and isolation, but the signs were too clear. Something was happening outside the cabin, movement, shadows in the distance, figures lingering at the edge of the forest. Ethan could feel the oppressive weight of being watched. "Lyra," he said one evening, after noticing the strange energy fields around the cabin again. "Something's out there." Lyra, who had been staring out of the window at the evening sky, turned toward him, her luminous eyes fixed on him with a knowing intensity. She had sensed it too. "They are coming," she said, her voice steady, but Ethan could hear the underlying tremor. "The Valkyr." "The Valkyr?" Ethan repeated, confusion written across his face. He had never heard the name before. Lyra nodded solemnly, standing up and moving toward him. The Vakar are a faction of my people, warriors, hunters, mercenaries. They hunt down anyone who threatens their control over the galaxy. And I am their prey. Ethan's stomach sank. Prey? What do you mean? Lyra's gaze drifted to the window, her mind clearly elsewhere. I was sent to Earth to observe, to learn. But my people, my race, is divided. The Vakar do not share my ideals. They would destroy everything, Earth, my people, anyone who opposes them. She stopped, her shoulders tense as she faced him. When I left my planet, I broke their law. I betrayed them. And now, they've tracked me here. Ethan could hardly comprehend what he was hearing. He had assumed that Lyra's arrival on Earth was a peaceful mission. He had thought of her as an innocent outsider, someone trying to understand humanity. But now, he was confronted with the shocking truth that her arrival was no accident, and that her enemies had followed her here. Before Ethan could respond, there was a loud knock at the door. His heart raced as he moved toward it, instinctively moving closer to Lyra. Stay behind me, Ethan whispered urgently. His mind was racing, and panic was setting in. Who could be out there? What did they want? He opened the door slowly, his eyes scanning the area. At first, there was nothing, just the trees and the quiet rustling of leaves in the wind. But then he heard a voice, low and menacing, coming from the shadows. I know you're here, Lyra, the voice said. You can't hide from us. We'll find you, and when we do, you'll wish you never left. Ethan's blood ran cold. He didn't recognize the voice, but the tone was unmistakable, a threat. He stepped back, closing the door and locking it. His mind raced as he looked over at Lyra, whose face had gone pale. She had recognized the voice too. They've found us, Lyra whispered, fear creeping into her voice for the first time. The Vakar are here. Ethan looked out the window, his heart racing as he saw them. A group of 3 figures, cloaked in black, standing just outside the perimeter of the cabin. They were tall, their features hidden beneath helmets, their presence looming like a shadow over the cabin. He couldn't tell if they were human or something else, but one thing was certain, they were not friendly. The Vakar had come to claim her. Ethan turned to Lyra, his mind frantic. What do we do? Lyra's eyes flashed with resolve. We fight. We don't have a choice. She moved toward the door, but Ethan grabbed her arm, stopping her. You're not ready, Lyra. You're still weak from the crash. We need a plan. I'm not weak, she replied firmly, her voice low but filled with power. I may not have full control of my abilities yet, but I have enough to stop them. Ethan hesitated. He knew she was right, but part of him wanted to protect her from the danger she faced. He couldn't let her fight alone, not like this. They won't stop coming until they have me, Lyra continued, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him. And I won't let them take me. Not without a fight. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he realized that they were out of time. The Vakar would not stop until they had Lyra, and Ethan was about to face the impossible. 3 elite warriors. The galaxy's most feared mercenaries. And the only thing standing between them and victory was him. The tension in the air was palpable, suffocating in its intensity. Ethan could hear the faint hum of the Vakar's energy shields as they encircled the cabin, their presence like a dark storm closing in on them. They had tracked Lyra here, to Earth, and now they wanted her back. Ethan's mind raced, his thoughts a whirl of panic and determination. He looked at Lyra, who stood with her back straight and eyes narrowed in focus. Her body language had shifted, no longer the vulnerable being she had been when she first crash-landed. She now stood as an alien warrior in her own right, ready to face the oncoming storm. Ethan, Lyra said, her voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision they had to make. You have to trust me. I'll hold them off. You need to get to the ship. You have to leave before they overwhelm us. Ethan shook his head immediately, his chest tightening with a fierce protectiveness. I'm not leaving you. We fight together, Lyra. I don't care what they've done or who they are. We stand together. Lyra's eyes softened for a moment, her gaze meeting his, but then the steely resolve returned. This isn't just about us. If the Vakar take me, they'll destroy Earth. My people are already in conflict with them. The last thing we need is them knowing we're hiding here. Ethan was still processing the gravity of her words when a loud crash echoed from outside the cabin, followed by the unmistakable sound of alien energy weapons powering up. It was too late to run. "They're here," Lyra said, her voice barely above a whisper. With no time to spare, Lyra's hands shot forward, and the room filled with a sudden hum of energy. Ethan watched in awe as she summoned her power, her glowing hands forming an invisible shield around them. The Valkyr's energy blasts, which would have easily obliterated anything in their path, collided harmlessly against the shimmering barrier. But Ethan knew it wouldn't hold forever. He needed to act. As the first Valkyr warrior appeared at the door, his armor gleaming with a menacing red hue, Ethan grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it toward him. The warrior swiped it aside with a flick of his hand, a simple gesture that demonstrated just how outmatched they were. The sheer power of these elite soldiers was overwhelming. Lyra looked at Ethan, a spark of realization flashing in her eyes. She couldn't keep this up forever. She needed help. "Ethan, there's a way to defeat them, but I need you to trust me completely. Do you?" Ethan nodded, despite the fear gnawing at him. "I trust you, Lyra." Without warning, Lyra waved her hand, and the rock that had been lying in the corner of the room levitated into the air. It was a small, unassuming rock, nothing more than a simple, jagged stone. "What are you?" Ethan began to ask, but Lyra was already focused. The rock began to glow with an eerie light, pulsating with energy. She glanced at Ethan. "Throw it. Throw it at them. Trust me." Ethan didn't hesitate. With all his strength, he hurled the rock straight at the first Valkyr warrior, who was just about to fire his weapon at them. The rock flew through the air like a missile, and as it collided with the Valkyr's shield, something extraordinary happened. The shield shimmered, but then the rock exploded in a burst of energy, not just breaking through the Valkyr's defense but sending the soldier flying back. The blast sent shockwaves through the room, knocking Ethan off his feet and throwing debris into the air. "What just happened?" Ethan gasped, stunned. "Pure energy manipulation," Lyra explained quickly, her eyes wide. "I can amplify the smallest object and transform it into a powerful force. That rock, it wasn't just a rock anymore. It was my will, my energy." Before they could process the victory, 2 more Valkyr soldiers emerged from the shadows. They were stronger, faster, and they knew exactly what Lyra was capable of now. They didn't hesitate, charging toward the cabin with frightening speed. Lyra raised her hands again, but this time, she was too drained. The Valkyr's attacks came faster, and her shield flickered with every blow. Ethan realized they couldn't keep up this defense forever. He glanced around, looking for anything, any advantage. That's when he saw it, a pile of metal debris from the wreckage of Lyra's ship. His mind raced. If he could distract the Valkyr long enough, maybe they could escape. But he needed to buy them time. "Lyra, I'm going to create a diversion. You have to make a run for it, get to the ship, and I'll follow you." Lyra looked at him, her face conflicted. "You don't have to do this. It's too dangerous." "I'm not leaving you again," Ethan said firmly. "I can help. Trust me." With no more time for debate, Ethan grabbed a piece of wreckage and threw it with all his might at the Valkyr soldiers. It was small, but the momentum and the distraction were enough. The Valkyr turned to face the object as it careened through the air, giving Lyra the opening she needed. She moved faster than Ethan thought possible, and in one swift motion, she unleashed an energy wave that knocked both Valkyr soldiers back, momentarily stunning them. "Now!" Lyra shouted as she ran toward the ship's remnants, her alien strength propelling her forward. Ethan followed closely behind, keeping an eye on the Valkyr soldiers, who were now recovering and regrouping. The air was crackling with energy as Lyra summoned every ounce of her remaining power, and in an instant, the wreckage of the ship came to life, lifting off the ground with a humming roar. The Valkyr, sensing their defeat, raised their weapons. But it was too late. As Lyra activated the ship's engines, the thrusters roared to life, creating a wave of energy that pushed the Valkyr back, sending them stumbling. The ship was alive, powered by Lyra's energy, ready to take flight. But as Ethan and Lyra climbed aboard the ship, he turned to see the remaining Valkyr soldiers preparing for one final charge. Ethan didn't hesitate. He reached down and grabbed the rock from the floor, throwing it once more with all his strength. This time, the rock struck the ground before the Valkyr could react, sending a shockwave that knocked them off their feet. Go! Now! Lyra shouted, her eyes wide with urgency. The ship lifted off the ground, breaking through the atmosphere as the world below them grew smaller. As they ascended, Ethan looked out the window, watching the distant figures of the Valkyr growing smaller. They had survived. But for how long? Lyra's energy was fading fast, and Ethan knew that their fight wasn't over. They had won this battle, but the war was far from finished. They were no longer just hiding from the Valkyr. They were running, trying to find a place where they could be safe. But as the stars stretched out before them, Ethan held Lyra's hand tightly. Together, they would face whatever came next. The roar of the ship's engines echoed in Ethan's ears as they soared into the starry abyss. The violent shaking of the cabin gradually settled as Lyra's ship, a sleek, alien vessel powered by her own energy, pierced through the clouds and into the higher atmosphere. Below, Earth faded into a blue and green orb, distant and serene, untouched by the chaos they'd left behind. Ethan's heart was still racing, his mind struggling to catch up with everything that had just transpired. They had done the impossible. They had fought off the Valkyr, those elite mercenaries, with nothing but a rock and Lyra's energy. But now, as the threat faded behind them, a new reality began to sink in. They weren't safe yet. They had escaped, but the galaxy was vast and filled with dangers. The Valkyr weren't the only threat lurking out there. Lyra sat at the controls, her hands gently moving over the holographic interfaces, her face a mask of concentration. Though she was physically drained, there was something in her eyes, an unspoken determination. She had survived, but she knew this was just the beginning. Lyra, Ethan's voice broke the silence, his eyes locked on her. We made it. We actually made it. She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips, but it didn't reach her eyes. She was still too focused, still too aware of what lay ahead. Yes, but the war is just beginning, Ethan. The Valkyr will keep coming. They won't stop until they have me, or until they destroy everything I care about. Ethan looked out of the window, watching the stars streak past them, the vastness of space feeling more oppressive than ever. Then we'll fight them, Lyra. Together. We don't have to face this alone. Lyra's eyes softened as she turned toward him. I never wanted you to be a part of this, Ethan. You're just a human. You have no idea what you're up against. I'm not just a human, he said firmly, standing and walking over to her. I'm the person who cares about you. And that's more than enough for me to fight for. Her gaze met his, and for a moment, they were both lost in the depths of each other's eyes. The bond they shared wasn't just one of survival, it was something deeper. They had already overcome the impossible together. Lyra knew in that moment that Ethan was right. He wasn't just some random person she had met on Earth. He was her strength. And she was his. But as they shared that unspoken understanding, the hum of the ship suddenly flickered. Lyra's brow furrowed as a warning light flashed across the cockpit. What's happening? Ethan asked, his stomach tightening with unease. We've got company, Lyra said with a grimace. Valkyr reinforcements. They're using a cloaking device to follow us. Ethan's pulse quickened as he turned toward the window. Through the transparent hull, he could see the flicker of another ship, hidden in the vastness of space, but unmistakable in its shape. The Valkyr weren't just after Lyra. They had come to end her, and anyone who stood in their way. We need to get to the defense systems, Lyra said urgently, pulling Ethan toward the back of the ship. We have to outmaneuver them, or we're done for. The ship trembled again, this time from the force of the Valkyr's first attack. Ethan could feel the jolt deep in his bones as the external shields absorbed the blast. Lyra moved quickly, activating the ship's defense systems. The air around them crackled with energy as she manipulated the controls, trying to block out the incoming fire. Hold on, Lyra shouted as she initiated the ship's evasive maneuvers. The ship tilted sharply, sending them both careening against the walls. Ethan's breath caught in his chest, his stomach doing flips as the ship spun through the vacuum of space. The Valkyr ship had found them, and they weren't backing off. Lyra, though weakened, was still in full control of the ship's power, but her strength was fading. Every blast from the Valkyr ship drained her energy further, and Ethan could see the effort it took for her to keep the ship stable. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she concentrated, her hands flying across the holographic controls. "You need to stop them, Ethan," she gasped, her voice strained. "I can't keep this up much longer." Ethan's mind raced. He wasn't a trained fighter, but he had something the Valkyr didn't, the element of surprise. He grabbed one of the alien energy weapons that Lyra had shown him earlier. It was a sleek, plasma-based pistol designed for precision. He wasn't sure how it worked, but he knew one thing for certain: it was their only chance. Without thinking, he ran toward the rear hatch of the ship, activating the external door. The rush of cold, dark space greeted him. Ethan barely hesitated as he stepped out, using the weapon to brace himself against the ship's hull. The Valkyr ship loomed ahead, its powerful engines glowing with energy. He aimed carefully, trying to steady his hands as he fired. The shot hit the Valkyr ship's engine port, causing a burst of sparks to fly from the vulnerable spot. It was a lucky shot, one that would give them the edge they needed. Ethan fired again, and the ship's hull began to crack under the pressure of the blasts. But then, without warning, the ship began to shudder violently, as if it were on the brink of collapsing. "Ethan!" Lyra's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Get back inside. It's too dangerous out there." Just as Ethan turned to make his way back to the ship, a new, more intense burst of energy came from the Valkyr ship. The force knocked Ethan off his feet, sending him hurtling into the cold void of space. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. Ethan's body spun in the weightlessness, his breath caught in his chest. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The cold enveloped him like a vice, and the silence was absolute. Then, just as he thought he would lose consciousness, he felt it, a tug, a pull. Lyra's energy, reaching out to him, pulling him back toward the ship. With a final burst of strength, he was back inside the safety of the cabin. Lyra, her face pale but determined, pulled him into her arms as the Valkyr ship began to retreat, its hull damaged beyond repair. The ship's engine sputtered, and with a final blast of power, it veered off into the distance. "We did it," Lyra whispered, holding Ethan tightly. "We're safe for now." But Ethan knew that this victory was only temporary. They had survived, this time. But the war was far from over. The Valkyr would return, and they would be stronger than ever. As the stars stretched out before them, Ethan looked at Lyra, knowing that their journey was just beginning. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans.